Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's webcast on Reimagining Succession Planning. I'm Mary Young, Principal Researcher at the Human Capital at the Conference Board, and I will introduce you shortly to my guest today, Eileen Gotzman. But first, I want to just go over a few simple logistics here. And first of all, I want to give you an idea of what we're going to be covering in today's webcast. You'll get a chance right at the start to place your own organization on Korn Ferry's succession continuum, to sort of take stock of where you are today. Then, as you think about how to move forward in that continuum, you'll have a chance with Eileen to explore how some top organizations are reshaping their talent management practices in order to keep pace with a rapidly disrupted business environment. And then thirdly, you'll learn from Eileen about best practices in identifying, developing, attracting talent that you're going to need for the future. So we have some really interesting content to share with you. Before we do, however, I want to just review these logistics. If you are participating, we're really glad so many of you have chosen to do that today. But if you're participating in hopes of getting some credits, you need to know simply that you have to stay with the webcast to the end. And as you see in these directions, you'll choose one of these three kinds of credit and then indicate that in the space provided, that that's the sort of credit that you want to take from today's webcast. So that's pretty simple. Then finally, I want to introduce Eileen Gotzman, Dr. Eileen Gotzman, who leads Korn Ferry's practice in assessment and succession. And welcome to today, Eileen, from Chicago. Yeah. Thank you. Eileen, I'm going to just turn this right over to you to begin walking us through Korn Ferry's succession continuum so that our viewers can take a moment to reflect on where their own organizations are today.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. So I think a lot about succession, as I'm sure many of you do, and why it's working, why it's not working. We hear complaints from all over the world about succession. People talk about why they don't have enough people, the right people, diverse people, why those that they put in jobs don't work out, why the people that they do have on their succession charts are not the ones that they're going to need for the future. And I hear this from CEOs, boards, senior leaders, HR leaders, even from individuals themselves who are on the succession charts. So it's very clear that succession isn't working well. So I want to thank you for joining today. And what we'd like to do is really toss out a couple of ideas to stimulate your thinking about succession so you could start on your journey to think about how you might reimagine your succession process. So I think a good way to start is by looking at where you are. You know, on any journey you're going to go on, you need to know what your starting point is so that you can see how far you have to go. So what we have here is a continuum that we've created, and I'm going to go through this with you first and then give you a chance to vote so we can look at the audience and see how we're all doing. So the first is what we call maintain. And you think about that as more of a get-it-done orientation. This is where you want to get the process done, you have certain deadlines, ratings are what's important. So it's the idea that you've set this up and it's a commitment that you're going to make. So that's the maintain. The evolve is more of a risk management. That's when you're starting to think about, well, what are the risks if we don't have the right talent? And there tends to be more of a focus in this stage on the ready now. So it's more focused, tends to be more focused on the shorter term, what we might call the emergency. The third part of this continuum is around refreshing. So here's where you're starting to think about talent in terms of asset management. Who are your people? What's the best way to deploy them and to grow them? And really start to think about the individuals, their goals, their ambitions, what's their capabilities. The fourth part of the continuum is the disruption. So that's when you're getting more of a portfolio mindset and you're thinking externally, do I have the best people? Thinking externally and internally. You have more of a mindset of a talent scout. You're ready to take some bold decisions. And that's where you're really taking more of a leadership role. So we have maintain, evolve, refresh, and disrupt. Let's go to our poll and see where everybody is on this.
While we're doing that, Eileen, I'll just mention that we have a really impressive number of people who've registered for this webcast, which shows that it's, of high interest. And what I want to encourage you to do is in the lower left of your screen to submit questions when they occur to you, and I'll monitor those, and I'll either interject them or save them for later on. But please don't hesitate to send us questions.
All right, well, I think our polling results have come in, and what we clearly see is that most of the organization places themselves in the evolve, more of that emergency shorter-term succession. A second group is in the refresh, which is great to see. Very few people on the disrupt. And maybe some of those people will chime in with some things in our chat and question to share some of their practices, and also a smaller group in that first maintain. So that's good to see. We know that then for the bulk of the organization, they're in those middle two earlier in the journey. So let's continue on our journey to see how we can get to reimagining. We'll go back to our slides now. Okay, thank you. Okay, here we go. All right, so I'm going to talk about some research that we've done at Korn Ferry. It's come from interviews that we've done with some leading global organizations, some of whom are mature and others we'll call scrappy, with global organizations around the world, trying to get what the most up-to-date thinking is about talent management, and particularly around succession. We also challenged ourselves, because we have consultants all around the world who deal with these issues regularly, to chime in with what they've been seeing, hearing on this topic as well. And all of this is pulled together in a report on reimagining talent management that is available to you on the Korn Ferry website. I'm going to focus now, though, on the reimagining succession. There's 9 thoughts that we'd like to outline for you today, and it's very deliberate 9. Most people try to do the 10, top 10, but since the 9 box is so heavily embedded in terms of how we think about succession, we thought it would be good to talk about 9 ideas. So let's go through each one of those. So the first one has to do with thinking about your business needs and the capabilities that you're going to need for the future. So that the idea here is that as your business is changing, the needs for the future may not be, and most likely aren't going to be, the same as what you have today. There's an organization, as an example, that I've been working with that is in the industrial manufacturing area, and they make parts for commercial motors. Sometime in the future, commercial motors may become electric. We don't know whether that's going to be in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and in fact, maybe it won't happen at all. But if it does happen, it's going to dramatically impact their business. So they have to think about preparing for the unknown. And how do they do that? Well, what they've decided is they need to head down 2 paths simultaneously. One is they need to maintain their current operational excellence, and at the same time, they need to think about innovation and disruption. So they're going to need to have capabilities of both types of leaders. So in their succession, they've identified profiles of those that focus on operational excellence and those that focus on innovation, 2 very different types of leaders. As you think about this, you can take it to the next stage, which is turning it into a success profile. So a success profile is not the same thing as a job description. It's a future-oriented document that outlines what the critical differentiators are for success in the future. So you can have, for example, a success profile around what an agile leader might look like, or what an inclusive leader, or a digital leader. We've just come out with a new study that we call a self-disruptive leader, and you can find out that on the website. But the idea is that the success profile outlines what is needed for success. We're seeing a lot of organizations now show interest in creating these for general manager positions, for those general types of roles. And the reason that they're doing that is there's not any one path moving forward to think about what a general manager is. Is a general manager going to be in a turnaround situation? Is it going to be at a startup? Is it going to be stay the course? There's all different people who have the title of general manager, the kinds of things that we're going to ask them to do. So you could think about organizing your talent reviews in terms of capabilities, not in terms of the roles, which may not even be the roles you have in the future. And so,
this may be an appropriate time to interject this question, or you may prefer that we save it till later, but one of our viewers has asked, given the speed with which skills requirements change, capabilities, and the slowness with which your frameworks takes to update them, what is the role of skills in deciding, what you need or what you're looking for?
Okay, great question, and love to tackle that right now. So skills are one part of what you should be looking at. Absolutely, and you need to keep updating what those skills are. And I'm going to be talking about this as a theme all the way through. So the skills that you think are needed now may not be the ones in the future. But we also believe that you need to think about experiences, which are different than skills, and you also need to think about things such as the personality traits. That's when you get into areas like learning agility, and also the person's motivation. Some of these aspects are less changeable. These are things that people bring with them from role to role. And so in the example that I was giving a moment ago about the organization that may face the disruption, they need people who are very detail-oriented, who are going to continue to look at operational excellence. So there are some personality traits and drivers for that operational excellence that will be needed, even though the particular skill sets might differ depending on how digital their manufacturing goes. The disruptive leaders are going to need different qualities. So you do have to constantly update your success profiles, but you can get them close enough around those capabilities to be useful for you.
May I just add another question here? Somebody has asked, how do you manage or control for people's bias in making these kinds of assessments?
Okay, so we haven't yet talked about assessments. We're talking about yet the profile. And once you have the profile, there's a variety of tools that you can use to make the assessments. You have online assessments that can assess for skills or personality traits or what motivates people. You have interviews, you have simulations, you have data from 360s. There's a wide variety of tools you can use, but you need to assess them against something, and that's where that success profile comes in.
Excuse me, actually this person was asking, I think, more about the subjectivity of the success profiles themselves.
Okay, so when you're creating a success profile, you want to consider multiple sources of input. So, a process that we like to use is we talk to people who are inside the organization who are thinking about this, and a wide variety of people as well, not necessarily those in that associated with that area. You get the internal. We also bring in an external perspective as well, often from people who are deep experts in that industry or in looking externally for that roles. We also have a database around success profiles and a lot of research on leadership. So are things out there that you can use to bring in and challenge your thinking inside and outside, to bring it all together. But it should never be, I talk to one person and based on what that one person says, that's what the success profile is, because you want to have challenging back and forth about from those different stakeholders and sources of input. Okay, so you could think about when you're creating profiles, I just want to come back to this general manager example, that you might have a profile for turnaround. You might have a profile for a startup. You might have a profile for the maintenance. And those buckets of skills and personality and so on are, because they're not so specific as a job description, they're less likely to change. And we'll talk about a little bit later about how you can think about giving people experiences in those areas. So you can imagine how you would have a succession discussion if you were talking about capabilities and not talking about roles. Very, very different discussion in a talent review to say who are our people who are capable of turnarounds, who are our people who are capable of going out there and opening a new market for us in China. So immediately you're changing that conversation. The second idea has to do with talent intimacy, and we had a lot of debate around that term intimacy. Obviously it can be a charged one, but what we mean really getting to know your talent in an appropriate way, needing to understand what the purpose is of the individuals and what drives them, and having a much more people-centric conversation than you currently have. The reason for having that conversation is because you don't always know what people want, and they don't always know what they want. So we did a very groundbreaking study with the Rockefeller Foundation about a year ago. It's actually one of the most requested studies from our website, where we interviewed nearly all of the current and former female CEOs. We were looking for themes about how did they get from here to there. And there's a lot of interesting stuff in there we don't have time to talk about, but one of the ones I want to talk about right now is that over half of the women did not know that they had the possibility of being a CEO. When they were asked, you know, what's your career ambitions? They didn't say, oh, I'm raising my hand, I want to be a CEO. What they told us is that someone, typically a mentor or a boss, said to them, you know, you could be a CEO. So that's very important to think about, because if you don't know your talent and you don't have a two-way conversation, how will you not only know what people are thinking about, but be able to influence them as well in terms of where they might be headed? You know, I sit in on a lot of different talent reviews, and I'm sure everybody on this call either runs them or sits in on them all the time too. And one of the things I hear a lot is very definitive statements about people. You know, you will never relocate, you know, said with conviction. You know, when you start to probe that, you find things out like maybe they talked to Mary 10 years ago, and maybe that was true at that time and nobody's asked even since then, but that label doesn't want to relocate stuck at that, and it's stuck for 10 years. We all know people's personal circumstances change. They get married and divorced, they have kids, their kids grow up, elder care issues. I mean, so many things influence. And when you talk to people live, you hear always, well, it depends. What's the offer? Who would I be working for? What would I be doing? So unless you do that check-in, challenge your assumptions, and really help people shape their aspirations. What I was saying from the Women CEO study, a lot of times people don't realize what it means to relocate, how that can impact their career, what they can learn, and how that may open options for them. So it's very important to get that level of intimacy so you don't miss out on the information that you need. One of the things that's important is to minimize labels that are just going to be a shorthand. You know, we hear a lot about, you know, people, we've identified our potentials. Well, potential for what? Potential, as I was using with the GM example, potential for those who could do a turnaround, potential for those who are great at operational excellence. The labels can be misleading, and those labels are often why you end up with a talent pool that doesn't meet your needs. And I'm bringing this up and hitting this hard because so many organizations now have bought online systems where they can keep track of all of their talent. And so there's a great tendency to want to assign numerical scores to people. You know, relocatable, 1, 2, 3. You know, then that's entered in there, and then you sort by, you know, whatever numbers you've put in there. You know, that's how you can end up with misinformation about people and end up with the bench.
We all know how bad tagging is sometimes. So would you really want your career determined by what somebody tagged you as? Yeah, it's a nightmare.
That's right. Yes, absolutely. So when we think about this idea that you can influence people's aspirations, we know that there's not only gender differences in this, there's cultural differences in this. People may have hidden ambitions, but be more modest about speaking. Some people, maybe because of what they were exposed to in growing up, don't dare to dream all the way to the top. There's so many differences in terms of people's willingness. And of course, we all know people who will raise their hands and say, you know, I want to be this, even though they're not well qualified. So how can you help people with their career advice? Because most organizations can't really afford the talent intimacy for every single individual. So a provocative idea that we want to throw out there is, should you differentiate and use a high touch and a high tech, or a high low touch, however you want to call it, way of providing career advice? So actually create some career specialists who will focus on guiding the top talent in your organization, help them see what their possibilities are, help them guide that, and at the same time offer career advice online for everyone, more of a self-service. It's a different way of thinking about it. We in human resources often like to treat everybody the same, so we may want to offer all of this, but in a time of limited resources, where we don't have opportunities, the same opportunities for everyone, I think it's something to think about. How do we shape the aspirations of our most talented people?
Well, in a way, Eileen, I would say it kind of democratizes career opportunities in that it gives every individual, or theoretically can, tools for knowing what's in demand, how they measure up to the requirements, where they might go for developmental opportunities. So everybody's going to have visibility to some of that. And then we've got our chip way of nurturing hypo talent, but I like it.
Well, good. Yeah, and I think that's the wonderful thing about having the online tools and the online access, is that we can help everyone, and we move it away from the more traditional, we'll talk to your manager, where those managers may not be equipped. So that's something definitely
We have
wonderful.
Another good question here. Let me interject. And somebody asks, how do you select, train the kind of career experts who could be used in this model? Where do they come from?
Yeah, well, they can be similar to the criteria that I'm sure many of you are using now around mentoring programs. It's people who have very good skills at knowing the organization and being good listeners and coaches, really can create the dialogue with the individual and see possibilities. So it's more about the style of the person, some of their personality, and of course their knowledge of the organization, and less about what functional area that they come from or any kind of school learning or degree.
And somebody's asked, what would be the difference between the manager's role in coaching for career development versus that of the mentor?
Well, the manager may not see the possibilities. I mean, it's such an obvious statement, but all managers are not created alike. Some of them cannot envision the future, all the possibilities where the organization is going. They also may have spent their career in a particular functional area, so they don't know what the alternatives are. You know, if you're in finance, maybe your boss is someone has spent their whole career in finance, and they don't realize that there are paths where you can use finance in M&A, in strategic planning, in general management, in quality. I mean, it goes on, in investor relations. So it's more about having people who can make these interconnections. Certainly we want the boss to be helpful and supportive, but we can't always rely on them to know all of the possibilities about the future, and many of the skill sets and experiences may fall outside of their realm. So it's a lot to ask. It's a far bridge for a manager. So when we think about careers, some of you, depending on whether you have children or your age, may know what this visual looks like. It's a picture of the children's game Chutes and Ladders, which is a popular game for kids before they can read. If you've not heard of it, it's sort of similar to the Harry Potter ladders. They go off in different directions. The idea is that careers can move up, they can move down, they can move sideways. There might not even be a career path. You might need to bushwhack through the jungle to get there. So I want to urge you not to succumb to the pressure of creating fixed career paths for people. There's a comfort that people want to know I move from accountant 1 to accountant 2 to accountant 3, or I take 2 steps here and then I move over there. That's when you end up with issues later on where you don't have the people you need in order for success. If you're thinking about broad capabilities, then your discussions aren't around roles, they're around how can people best develop those capabilities. And there's many routes to develop those capabilities. So if you think it's important for people to have some sort of experience with innovation, there are task forces, there are various teams, there's businesses that they can go into, and they can get that experience from a finance role, from an HR role. So really, you need to think about what are the different ways that you can build capability without having to have one role to the next, to the next, to the next. When we typically do this, we look at career assignments. So most of the admired organizations, in our experience, do this a lot. They move people around to different roles. The important thing to think about, though, is that these assignments don't have to be up. They can be sideways, they can be downwards, they can be diagonal. And, you know, I can almost hear the objections coming in. Well, what about pay? And one of the things that we've seen organizations do is they hold the pay constant for that person if they're going to move them down so that there is no penalty. There's an organization that I've been working with for about 10 years. And I bring it up as an example because I hear all the time from people like, well, we couldn't possibly do some of these things because we're very small. Well, this organization has only 500 people in it at the exempt level. And they are in a secondary city one that not a lot of people want to relocate to. So once they hire people, they need to keep them, and they pretty much know all of their future talent has to come from this group of people. What they do is really think carefully about how to manage the careers like the chutes and ladders. So one of the people that I very early on assessed was working at an individual contributor as an attorney. Her next job was to head up a small business, and they put her into that business unit because they knew there were safe hands underneath. And they were real explicit with her about what they wanted her to learn in that role, dealing with customers, union negotiations, and a bunch of other things. So giving her that opportunity with some oversight. Then they moved her to be board secretary so that she had the opportunity to learn about being with the board. Then they moved her to strategic planning so she could learn about how to shape their future strategy. So they had created a profile of what their senior CEO, COO executives need to look like, and have moved her, and she's not the only one, just using her as an example, back and forth and up and down. In some of these roles, she was reporting to peers, and in one case, even reporting to someone who had been her subordinate. They kept her pay the same, but the whole time, they had their eyes and her eyes on where she was going to be heading in the future. And now, 10 years later, she's in line to be the next CEO. So think about how you can move your people around, be explicit with them about what they need to learn, and use that to build capabilities. Okay, new idea that I want to throw out there that's a little bit controversial, but hear me out on this. When you are dealing with a retailer, you may or may not know that they've assigned to you a customer value score. So it could be Amazon, could be other types of retailers. So they are assigning that score based on whether you're buying full price or not, or you wait for the sale. Are you a person who returns things all the time or not? Are you writing positive or negative online reviews? They're figuring out what your worth is to their organization. And based on that, they're deciding how they're going to treat you. And the most obvious example of this, the one that we all know, is airlines, who are quite transparent about this. You want to get on that plane first? Here's what you need to do. Buy those full price tickets, not those non-refundable ones, fly us all the time, and so on. So very clear about what the value is. So the idea I want to throw out there is, why aren't we talking about scoring employee value as well, the employee value to the organization? And when I talked about this in the past, people make yucky faces about this. They don't like that. But I'm going to say to you, you already do this implicitly. When somebody gets a counteroffer, you already decide who's worth it for you to raise their salary or let them go. If somebody has a complaint, you decide whether you're going to go down to their office and deal with them or write them an email 3 days later. So implicit, you already are assigning a value. Why not make that part of your succession as well, and think about the value of employees and differentiate the way that we see some of these online retailers doing, and creating actually different experiences. So something for consideration here. Okay, the fifth idea I want to talk about is thinking about the talent that you have, not only internally, but compared to the outside. So when you are going through your talent reviews and thinking about succession, how do you know if the people you have are really the best out there? For your critical roles, should you spend some time thinking about that, thinking about, who's out there and what skills and experiences and so on do they have compared to the ones that you have. Now, obviously, you can't afford to do this for every one of your roles, but there are certain ones that are more critical. And you need that confidence to know that what you have is absolutely the best, because the people that you hired at the point you hired them may have been the best then, but are they the best now? And how are you going to get to that future without knowing that you have the best? And we've done quite a bit of work on this, looking at particularly around the personality traits and drivers, that people who are a good fit with the success profiles tend to be those that are highly engaged and perform better in their roles. So think a little bit about how you might find who those people are who are the best. They may not be in plain sight, the people that you want. What I wanted to have you think about is how a board typically thinks about this. Boards tend to be more open to rethinking succession than we in human resources are. They're not afraid to take a retired CEO and bring him or her in for 2 years to fill a role till someone gets ready, and then moving that person out, or asking a board member to step in, or looking at the talent on the outside, even though they have successors on the inside, because they want to do the due diligence and know that they have absolutely the best. These are the kinds of things that are discussed in the boardroom. How do we know we have the best? How are we going to think about the build, the buy, the borrow? Why not apply some of that type of thinking as you're talking about your succession? You have critical roles that need to be filled. Maybe people don't have the capabilities now. Maybe you bring someone in from the outside who could fill that role for 2 years and help accelerate the development of somebody inside, and maybe they're at the point in their career where then they're going to be ready to move on. Something to think about.
For me, raises a question, because I work a lot in the area of human capital analytics and strategic workforce planning. We're seeing many more rich sources of external data about overall talent supply by vendors who are scraping data from job sites and can give you very fine-grained analyses of, what's the supply of people with these capabilities, these skills and competencies you're looking for. Can you really find cybersecurity leaders who also speak French and know supply chain or whatever? Are you seeing much of this entering the field?
Yes, absolutely. Seeing people particularly looking at LinkedIn and trying to identify there, and not just looking, but making sure that, back to an idea I talked about earlier about being talent scouts, that at industry conferences, having conversations with some of those people, getting to know them a little bit more, talking with executive search consultants, many of them, to say what's out there, interviewing. Some of the leaders that I work with think of themselves first and foremost as talent scouts. They're always, when they're flying into different cities, meeting with people, keeping track of people in their careers, have huge LinkedIn connection bases, precisely so they can answer this question about whether or not they have the best. So I think the web scraping is a good start, but then you have to take it further to knowing a little bit more about the individuals.
We have a question here. Let me interject one about, by the way, we have a number of questions from participants about various resources or things that you might be able to provide. I'm going to save those to the end, but here's one I'd like to ask now, which is, how do you prevent, I guess we might call it talent hoarding, but managers who don't want to let go of people and send them on rotation assignments because they don't want to lose that, highly valuable talent?
Okay, yes, great question. So succession is an organizational sport. It is not an individual department or function sport. And so the way it is set up, the rules of the game, and I use support very deliberately so that we could talk about sort of the rules of the game, are that those, and I'm going back to my point about the employee value score, Those that you have differentiated that are part of your future are going to be enterprise talent. And it is the role of those who are involved in succession to be able to find and advocate for those people and be able to move them. Let's go back again to the mind of the board the mindset of the board. They are thinking across the whole organization. They're not thinking department by department, and is somebody going to, quote, let their person go to take a C-suite role? So it's changing that mindset and thinking about it as the enterprise talent. Where this is not people aren't indentured to that manager, and that's the fastest way to lose your talent, is to prevent them from realizing what their dreams and potential are.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So just challenge yourself to think about successors. Do they have to be regular full-time employees? We're seeing a lot more creativity. Could you bring someone in as a contractor in order to have someone fill a need? Maybe you're thinking that the person that you really want for a role is located now in China, and it's another year before you're going to bring them back. Is there somebody who could come in as a contractor? Could you rehire, bring somebody back, bring a retiree, rotate somebody else in and out? The whole idea here is, when you're thinking about succession, are there ways to broaden inside and outside and not just have the name, it goes into the role, and that's that? We also think about succession, this is our seventh idea, as being really an individual sport. We put a name in the box, we move that individual. But all of us know in our hearts and in all the research about the importance of the team. We say, well, we want to have that person pick their own team. But think about it. The person comes into that role, and it's like drinking out of a fire hose. It's going to take them maybe 3 months, probably more like 6 or 9 months, till they get the lay of the land, figure the whole thing out. Then they have to recruit and swap out people. So sometimes you've lost a whole year while that person is trying to change out the talent on their team, when you, in the first place, knew what some of the issues are. You knew when you put the person in the role, they lack certain capabilities. Maybe they had less experience in strategic planning. So why not put somebody in the role on their team who has that, or someone who has more customer experience? Why not help them along to try to put that team together? And again, turning back to boards, we see them do this all the time. They are very aware of the close relationship between a CEO and a CFO. And if a new CEO is coming in, they want a steady hand with a CFO, and they'll think about getting someone in that role and keeping them there and incenting them so they can create that strong team coming in. So think about succession in terms of the team, and you will get a better return on the investment when you put the person in the role.
That makes lots and lots of sense. And I mean, instead of just focusing on the individual, it'll take that person a long time to figure out where the weak spots are, and you know them.
That's right. And people might say, well, we don't know the chemistry with the individuals, but it's rare. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It's very rare for a new leader to fire their entire team or to move them all out. So usually there are people that are already there that are staying. And if you're picking people who are talented to be on that team, it's a good bet. You already know things about their styles and their personalities, that they're going to be able to make it work out, particularly when, as part of moving in the roles, you're being very explicit about what you want them to do. And, you know, as the example I gave earlier in that small organization, when they moved that woman around, they were explicit. We're moving you in so you can learn from John and Sally, because they're really experts on this. And that really helps meld the team. So this is a topic I know is near and dear to your heart, Mary, about the measuring impact, about that. You know, the measurement is really the language of business, and it is so important to be able to show the ROI of what it is that you're doing in succession. You know, I gave a couple of examples throughout. You know, we've measured fit with the profile produces an ROI. We've measured the ROI of our assessments. You're going to need to show, if you're going to move towards measuring capabilities, that produces a better result than not doing it that way. You may get the door open to try something different, but to keep the door open, you're going to have to show that this produces better results. So from the start, you'd be thinking about, how will we know if this works?
And that thinking up front before you do things is so important, because too often measurement is just an afterthought, and it should really inform what it is, the solutions that you design. We have a couple of questions. We have more than a couple. We could almost have 9 questions on 9-box and 9-box related. Somebody has asked whether that's sort of outmoded and too rigid. Another person has said, what about a 4-box? Can a 4-box combined with a 9-box, which gives you 13-box, would that, is that a better approach? What do you think?
What I think is that it's the axes, not the number of boxes, that are important. And this is something that organizations often don't get right. What should the axes be for you? So, and is there only one 9-box, or is it more organized around the capabilities? You know, think back to that example that I gave around the organization with the electric motors. They need to maintain operational excellence. The people who are high performing right now and the people who have potential to really do the continuous improvement, their layout in that 9-box or 4-box or 20 boxes is going to be very different than the disruptors, the people who could form new partnerships and be innovative. So you might want to think about sorting by capability, and that becomes the grid within the capability, and moving people, so you have a capability grid for the whatever is relevant for your business, the stay the course, the turnaround, and you're sorting people within that. So I would make it less complex and more useful in the language of the business.
Thanks.
Okay. So let me go to the last idea, and then we certainly have time for many more questions here, which is about structuring HR. So far I've been talking all about the process. Now let's look inside about what we're doing. I think the question is whether HR is really structured to deliver talent to the organization. And right now, we see so many organizations around centers of excellence. In the center of excellence, we have distinct silos. So we have recruiting, separate from learning and development, separate from pay. What if we were organized around issues, business issues, as opposed to our silos, that people would collaborate and integrate around them? So an issue was, how do we drive more innovation? How do we become a digital organization? How do we reduce turnover? Things that everybody talks about, but we typically handle them on a siloed way. So somebody asked earlier about how do we know, how do we prevent bias in doing a success profile? One of the best sources of outside-in advice in your organization is your recruiting function. But usually there's a big wall between recruiting and the talent management folks. But the recruiting people are out there seeing all the time about the talent that's available. If you were all working together to think about how do we create more innovation in our organization, you'd be able to think about the success profile, how do you reward them, what kind of talent's on the outside. So just something to think about whether the current structure really serves you well with succession, or whether there might be some other ways to think about that and get some greater collaboration.
I can see that being flexible around business issues so that the composition of that team might change. In a way, it's a little bit of an application of agile methods where you're taking a cross-functional approach based on what the needs are.
Yes. And even if you don't reorganize, would absolutely urge get the input of your internal recruiters, your external recruiters, get the input of your compensation people, because the different roles have outside in, inside out perspectives that will really help challenge the perspectives as you think about your success profiles. I know we may have more questions, so I'm just going to do a couple of final slides, and then we'll have time for some more. When you get your copy of the deck, maybe you want to take a more detailed version of this succession quiz. Think about this as a way of opening dialogue with not only within HR, but with some of your line managers, your senior executive. It can be pretty provocative, and it may lead to more of a reimagining as you go forward. So take a look at this when you get the detail. It's too small a print now to go over. And then if you want more information as you're thinking about what you're going to do, there's some places you can go on our website to look at some of the things. I talked about our Rockefeller study, self-disruptive leader. We have an article about this topic. There's a lot of things out there, or you can reach out to me, because obviously we are barely scratching the surface of a topic that I think we're all very passionate about.
Yeah, so let me jump in with a couple of questions. The first two have more to do with resources, and perhaps you can tell us whether there's a place on your website where people could get these, or maybe suggest somewhere else. But one person asked if you could give a longer list, or how they might get a longer list of the kinds of capabilities that companies might use to define what was the leadership profile they were looking for. Remember at the beginning you said operational excellence, another was innovation. Is there a longer list of such capabilities, strategic capabilities that people could take a look at?
Yes. So there, the work that we've done on earlier on the 4 dimensions of leadership, the skills, experiences, traits, and drivers, we've used that to create a number of profiles and look at that. So yes, you can find more information, but I would really urge you to use to use your internal sources to make sure that it's right for you. Those of you that track your competitors, you can have 2 companies, 3 companies in the same competitive space, but they all have different strategies for getting there. So the capabilities that they're looking for will be very different. You have to keep in mind what your unique culture is, your unique strategy. So yes, you can use that. I always find it useful to start the discussions with a blank sheet, with a focus group or an interview, and listen to people, because the reactions are much more superficial if they're reacting to a list of capabilities. You tend to just check, this looks right.
Operational excellence.
If you're saying, yes, that's right. So the idea is you behind the scenes could then go look at the possibilities, but start by being expansive and inviting people to think more broadly.
Okay, so I've got quite a good list here. I'm going to try to move through these quickly. You were talking about when you sort of had your blue chip version of cultivating leaders' careers, and then the one that was sort of for every person. And I think it was in relation to that, somebody asked, can you recommend any web-based career planning advice? Any, where you might get that kind of offering from?
So there are a number of those out there. Korn Ferry has one, but we are one of many firms that have those type of offerings now. So I'd suggest probably
Market
doing your
research.
own
All right.
market research.
So
yes.
we've had several questions about, this is an age-old question in succession, but about transparency of who's in the succession pool, transparency to others in the organizations or to the candidates themselves, the hypos themselves. What's your view on that?
Okay, so if you moved away from roles to capabilities, then you can be transparent. We see you as having talent in turnaround situations. We're going to try to give you more experience in that. There's a lot of roles that you might be able to use that. We see you as strong in operational excellence. So it's a very different conversation if you're not talking about roles, and as people broaden, then it becomes a richer conversation with them, and it's never going to be static, because someone that you think, so you identify someone you think is going to be turnaround, and then you place them in the role, and maybe it's not as big a success. Maybe they didn't take the risks that you thought. You may move them out of that capability role elsewhere. The same advice I had about, defy the pressure to create these career paths. You sort of defy the pressure to put people, tell people about their name is on a box, because by the time they get there, that box may not even exist, or the needs for that may be. And then you have disappointed, angry people who were striving for something that's no longer possible about it. So we need to change our mindset.
So I want to end, before we almost end, with what I think is the most provocative question we've had from an audience member today. I'd love to hear what you think about this. But a person says, in the era of Me Too, how can rising leaders who make mistakes in the workplace recover from these mistakes so their career is not permanently derailed?
Okay. I think some of the answer to that depends on the culture of the organization, and obviously it also depends on, I'll say, how egregious what the person did was. I mean, it's no different, I guess, than the way we think about criminal justice. Some things are recoverable and some things are not. We'd also be looking for a degree of self-awareness and behavior change. There was a recent conference board meeting I went to where people were talking about diversity, and I just love the quote that they had about, you're not responsible for your thoughts, you're responsible for your actions. And so what we'd really be looking for is, how do they behave, and seeing that there is a difference in that behavior, as opposed to what the person just might say.
That's a great application, and it's also a great testament to the fact that there's value for people, even people who've been around for a long time and are experts in succession planning, from attending our conferences, which leads me to an opportunity to tell you that you can get a $500 discount on your registration for upcoming leadership development conference in June. And there's information here. And by the way, you'll be able to download these slides. So if you want to get that information, you can do so then. And then finally, here's another. We have a succession management conference coming up in November. Again, the $500 discount. And we were getting feedback from our audience already saying that they've really enjoyed the webcast. You will be receiving, however, a very quick evaluation following the webcast. And we take those very seriously. So we ask that you take the few minutes to fill that out, because they're of great interest to us. So I'd like to thank you very much. We've had a lot of people on this call, and you've had some great questions. And most of all, I'd like to thank Eileen Gotzman from Korn Ferry for giving us some really interesting ideas about the newest thinking in succession planning. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.